The axe hit the platform hard and the haft cracked under Marek's forearm. The blade sank into the oak, not flesh. Jacob expelled a wet, rattling cough and folded his fingers to his throat, tasting metal and saliva. Betrayal ran under his ribs. He had been brought to this platform by men he had once trusted, and that thought kept him watching faces among the crowd. They thought the sentence done. The sentence was only beginning. Blood soaked the linen at Jacob's neck. He blinked at a ring of faces, at torches bobbing like hungry insects. He tried to pull air and got a small, guttered sound. Marek stepped back with the axe, jaw tight, hands already wiping the haft with a rag. Magistrate Tomas held his ceremonial staff at a measured angle and scanned the square with a practiced calm. The immediate problem was obvious. The execution had failed and the town would not leave. Jacob's first action after the strike was simple and raw. He opened his mouth and named one name. Quiet at first, then louder when a woman in the front row looked up. Tomas, he slurred it, and the single word landed like a stone. Heads turned. Tomas's fingers tightened on the staff. The betrayal that had been a cold H in Jacob's chest now had a face. Marek crouched, checking the blade edge, but the crowd moved closer on its own motion. A boy shoved forward. "Torches waving? Finish him!" Someone shouted. The cry split the square and the ring closed a fraction. Marek raised his hands in a placating motion and said, "Back. Back now. Give him space." His voice was low. The words were a tool, not a plea. Jacob fixed his gaze on Magistrate Tomas. He remembered a council chamber window, a sealed parchment, the magistrate's ring catching candlelight the night Jacob was arrested. Those details came like small, solid objects he could count to keep his mind tethered. The ring, the parchment, the smell of sour wine on Tomas's breath. He whispered names to himself to stay awake, to prevent the dizziness that wanted to fold him inward. An official stepped forward, thin, same municipal badge as Tomas. "We will not turn disorder into spectacle," the man announced. He loosened his cloak to show impartial authority. Tomas did not object outwardly. He inclined his head and said, "Order must be preserved. Do not let rumor grow teeth here." His voice measured the square like a scale. The crowd did not disperse. Instead they rearranged. Women handed wooden stools to one another. A pair of men argued near the well over who could sit where. People traded coins for vantage, bartered bread for a handful of sawdust to throw underfoot. The action was mechanical, habitual, until habit hardened into ritual. Jacob could not see all their faces, but he felt their attention as a pressure, like hands pressing his shoulders. A child started a cruel game, who saw the blade miss. She cried, and grown men answered with a laugh that had no warmth. Someone tossed a roasted turnip at the platform, and it hit wood with a wet slap. The sound made Jacob flinch, and he coughed. He recognized the pattern, a small shock, then a new way to enjoy the old order. Fear, sharp and physical, moved through him in waves. He clenched his jaw and tried to count breaths between coughs. Night pressed in faster than the magistrate expected. Marek was ordered to hold position and not to finish the sentence until the council could decide, Tomas. And his tone implied blame would be redirected if they maintained a public record of restraint. "We show restraint. We show justice. Tomas, Marek, and the bailiffs. The town must see that law is upheld." His language was civic, but his eyes searched the crowd for gossip and advantage. Marek folded his shoulders and moved toward the executioner's shed. He spoke to a subordinate in a voice meant for private ears. The haft splintered. "I'll axe it." "I'll come back." The subordinate handed him oil and a spare rope. Marek's hands were methodical. He dipped the blade in oil, set a whetstone and methodically ran the edge. The action was a ritual of return. His resignation read like craft. If he performed well, he could avoid the deeper question in his palm, why the man still lived. Jacob's mouth was dry. He saw faces that belonged to him once. An old neighbor who had fixed his fence, a woman who had sold him rye. When he found a face he recognized, Petra, who had once been his sister-in-law, he mouthed words she could read. Petra stepped forward with an apron in her hands and shouted, "You lied to him, Tomas!" Her voice sliced the controlled murmur of the square. The accusation changed the center of gravity. Tomas's face did not flush, but his posture shifted. "Petra," he said, the name measured and cold. "Do not make false claims on a day of law." Petra jabbed a finger toward him. "You signed the warrant. You promised clemency to a witness and gave him to the gaolers instead." Static murmurs rippled. A new suspicion had been thrown into the ring, and it stuck on people's tongues. Marek returned to the platform because crowd dynamics demanded an anchor. He set the axe on the block and paused, staring at Jakub as though waiting to find the old worker under the stains. Jakub recited the names of men who had stood at his arrest, names he could not afford to forget. He them allowed to keep the world precise. The crowd listened, sometimes leaning in to hear a name, and then breaking into disorganized shouts. An argument broke out between two market vendors over who had the better vantage. The dispute escalated into shoving. Back. Back.
Marek shouted, "Jakub!
Hold still." His lines were short, edged with a man trying to control a crowd because control was his last legitimate tool. The vendors shoved anyhow. One tripped into a bench and violence slipped a little closer to the platform. Jakub felt a wet warmth on his chest and realized a child had smeared blood with a bare hand, as if to test if he was real. He spat and the taste was iron. He tried to tug his wrists free from rope that bit into his skin. Each tug sent a current of pain into his arms. His breathing shortened. He braced his teeth and said a name again, louder this time.
Tomasz! Answer me!
The magistrate's gaze slid to the front rows and stopped at a man in a council robe Jakub had seen at hearings. The man paled. His hand flew to his mouth. The square's energy shifted from morbid curiosity to a hunt for a betrayer. Questions mushroomed. Who had handed Jakub over? Who had forged testimony? Voices rose that wanted an answer beyond spectacle. That moment, when suspicion pivoted toward the magistrate, was the chapter's pivot. Tomas's composure fractured in small, precise ways. His fingers tapped the staff faster, his eyes flicked to a bailiff. He spoke to the bailiff in a low rush. Seize that man. Keep order. Take him to the watch. The order made his worry official. His priority became reputation. A mid-afternoon decision hardened into a night-long ritual. Groups formed shifts around the platform. Men lit extra torches and kept watch. They traded gossip in hushed voices. This recurrence turned the square into a rotating audience. People returned at dawn and at dusk, as if the spectacle were a market stall that reopened. Jakub lay in this wheel, naming faces to survive. Marek attempted a formal second stroke before darkness fell. He set the blade, aimed true, and the axe fell, but the rope slipped under Jakub's chin and the blow glanced along the jaw. Jakub's head snapped, his body convulsed. He remained alive. The crowd hissed and someone began to chant a song that mocked pain. The failed attempt intensified appetite. Failure made the ordeal last. The crowd's rituals hardened into cruelty. A group of men produced a spit and began to roast a leg of mutton beside the platform, offering slices to those in front. A woman pressed a preserved lemon to Jakub's tongue to make him cough. Children were coaxed to run hands through his hair to pull at the rope. Every small action was a decision to feed the spectacle. Marek lowered himself to Jakub's eye level and spoke without a fake tenderness. "Jakub," he said, naming him like a ledger entry, "hold. Do not thrash." "Don't make it worse for yourself," Jakub answered in a rasp. "Marek, you know who sent me." The exchange was short and stripped of rhetoric. Marek's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. His silence became a decision. An outsider arrived, a traveling priest with a small satchel, who claimed he could bless the condemned and hasten the end with a certain prayer. He pushed through the crowd and the square mulled over a new possibility, religious rite as entertainment and excuse. Tomasz weighed allowing the priest to speak. Permitting it would frame the event as divine judgment. Rejecting the priest would look like callousness. Tomasz nodded, and the priest stepped up, reciting lines that folded in ritual and commerce. The crowd's mood changed again. Curiosity sharpened into permission to escalate. Torches were raised higher. Men began to chant provocations at Jakub's lips. Someone in the front ripped at the linen tunic near Jakub's shoulder, exposing raw skin. The action produced a ripple. Someone else pushed forward. The ring, once orderly, dissolved into pockets of violence. Marek moved to reassert order. He walked along the platform's edge and put his hand on the haft as if it were a baton. He argued with a man who had grabbed a stool and threatened to climb onto the block. They traded short lines. "Put that down. Tomasz will not like this." "Marek, Tomasz did this. Let him watch." The man shot back. "Name yourself." Marek demanded. "Say your name." He spoke as an instrument of authority. "I am Jan." The man answered. "I am Jan from the tannery." The exchange was 3 short lines that changed the immediate scene into a named conflict. Jan's identity made him accountable and traceable. A surge happened after midnight. The crowd, drunk on a long night and new ferocity, breached the ring. They pushed aside the bailiffs. Marek was shoved back by a surge of bodies and the axe swung in panic rather than craft. The blade did not find its mark cleanly. It struck flesh and wood in a ragged, imprecise path. People screamed and then laughed in a strangled way. Jakub was dragged into the center of a violent cluster. Hands grabbed him and pulled at straps. Slaps landed on his back. Someone struck his thigh with a cudgel. He tasted bile. He tried to muffle a cry by biting the inside of his cheek. A woman screamed the magistrate's name and pointed.
There!
He sent him. Her finger jabbed at Tomas, who had been forced back against his days by the tide. Tomas pushed through his own bailiffs and yelled, "Seize anyone who strikes the peace." His voice trembled on the last word. The command made little difference in the press. The mob had become a body with a single appetite. Marek pushed and shoved, swung the axe, and then dropped it. His hands shook visibly when he recovered it. The instrument of death had become a blunt, terrified tool in a chaotic hand. At dawn the square resembled an altar ruined by weather. Blood pooled in grooves and the platform smoldered with the residue of torches. People left staggered and quieter than the night had been. Magistrate Tomas and Marek met behind a half-closed gate and spoke in low voices. They recast the chaos as divine wrath, a necessary purge born of sin. Tomas held a sealed parchment in his hand and folded it back into his robe. Marek tucked the axe in the corner and checked the haft again. They arranged a narrative that could be repeated, that the violence had been spontaneous punishment, that those who had struck had acted on holy anger. Tomas stamped a wax seal onto a square of paper and handed it to a bailiff. "Tell them it was judgment," he instructed. "Tell them it was required." His face was steady in the sunlight, but his fingers left a smudge on the parchment. Jakub lay under a thin moon and the last torches guttered. He watched a shoe left on the platform edge and a candle sputter out. His breathing was a small machine of survival. Petra slipped into the crowd and bent low to touch his hand. She whispered, "Jakub, remember your names. Remember them and tell later." The words were a practical order, not consolation. Petra pushed back into the square and shouted for a witness who could name the man who had signed Jakub's arrest. Two men stepped forward who had seen the council meeting, and one of them, Jan from the tannery, named a clerk who had carried a sealed packet. The new testimony created a shift. Suspicion that had grazed Tomas now had a path to follow. The discovery forced Tomas to add urgency to his cover-up. Marek and Tomas conferred one last time. "We will say a riot took him," Marek offered. "We will say the crowd finished what the law started." Tomas considered the line, then nodded. He folded the seal into his palm and put it back in his robe. "Do it," he said. His decision privatized the outcome and bent public memory. By first light the square was emptied and scrubbed of many traces, but not all. A single candle still burned near the poop-stained bench. A shoe lay where someone had kicked it off in a hurry. Jakub felt the wood under him and knew the specifics. The nick in the platform's rim where the haft had bounced, the crushed grain of oak under his cheek. He recorded these details to himself because facts are harder to erase than feelings. The chapter closes on a small, sharp image. Magistrate Tomas walking away with his staff angled like a scepter, Marek trailing with the axe wrapped in cloth, and Petra holding Jakub's hand as she led him toward the watch to be hidden from curious eyes. The magistrate's assistant lifted the sealed parchment and tucked it into a satchel. A bailiff hissed at a loiterer and the loiterer moved, head down. The ritual had been preserved. The truth would be smoothed until it fit the town's appetite. Jakub coughed once more, then forced his legs to a sitting position. He looked at Tomas and said, "You will be named." His voice was faint but steady. Tomas did not answer. He lifted his chin and walked away. The sentence had not ended on the platform. It had become a story they would tell. Jakub's last visible act in the chapter is to point with a trembling finger at the magistrates retreating back, and Petra whispering, "Hold to the names," as she led him toward a dark doorway where the town's account of the night would be written and rewritten. A market boy ran breathless into the square, shouting that the condemned was still breathing on the platform. The cry landed on Jakub's ears like a stone. Betrayal tightened across his chest. He forced his eyes open and counted the voices that answered the shout to measure what would come next. The problem was no longer whether he would die, it was whether the town would return and make his survival a spectacle. He had to keep track of faces, of the men who had put him there. Memory became a small tool to fight the betrayal that pushed at his ribs. Jacob pushed air through his cracked throat and tried to lift his head. He tasted iron and the sour tang of spit. The platform creaked under him when someone trod near the edge. He blinked to clear the dark at the edge of his vision and saw the boy's feet dart between crates, people following in a ragged line. A vendor shouted, "He's moving!" The shout pulled more bodies toward the square's rim. He tugged at the frayed rope wrapped around his wrists. Pain flared in his neck where rope burns had dug in, then receded into a dull, steady ache he could manage. Nothing. Noise collected in the square. The slap of sandals on packed earth, a wheeze that might be a cough or a laugh. Jacob counted the sounds, naming the shapes in his head to keep the world from slipping. He named the magistrate's voice first. Tomas, to himself, and then Marek, and held on to the cadence of their names. The first minutes were agony in small, concrete facts. He remembered the previous strike, not in metaphor but as a fact. The axe had struck wood and the haft had split under the executioner's grip. The blade bit oak, not flesh. That misfire had left him coughing wet air. It had left Marek staring at his hands as if the tools might betray him again. Jacob used that memory like a ledger. He recalled Marek's pause, the way the executioner had drawn a long breath and set his jaw. Those exact actions returned to him now, shaping what he would do next. People clustered into circles. The front row pressed elbows on the scaffold rail. Jacob watched a woman push a child forward by the shoulder. He mouthed the names of the prominent men who had brought him here. Magistrate Tomas, the clerk with the sealed packets, the constable who had tied the knot at his wrists. Naming kept him sharp. Naming focused the betrayal into faces he could see and punish if he survived. A murmur rolled through the crowd, and then stilled when Magistrate Tomas stepped onto the raised steps beside the platform. Jacob's eyes fixed on Tomas's robe and the way the signet ring flashed when the magistrate raised his hand. Tomas spoke in his measured cadence. "Order," he said. "We will decide what ends this." His voice was calm, merciless in the way the town had learned to listen to him. Jacob heard the word order and felt his resolve shift from numb endurance to a small, bitter clarity. He had survived the first strike and now the entire town contested whether he should be finished. That clarity pushed him to find one more act. He slid his fingers along the inside of his tunic and felt the folded wax packet tucked beneath the patch at his chest. The packet was thin and stiff against his ribs. He had not planned to show it. He had kept it like a pebble in a pocket. Now the crowd and the magistrate gave him reason. Voices lifted, "Finish him." A man called, "Let him bleed." Someone else said. Some pressed closer to see the twitch of his fingers. Jacob's mouth worked around a dry sound. He forced himself to speak, to break his silence on one precise point. "Tomas," he croaked the seal. His tongue scraped the word, heads turned. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. Tomas took a step down from his perch. "What is that?" he asked, loud enough that the nearest rows heard. The cadence of his question pulled the crowd's attention like a tether. Jacob slipped his hand up and drew the packet out with a motion that made him burn with effort. He held the waxed paper out with one shaking hand so the sun caught the stamp. The seal bore the town's municipal mark, pressed into soft wax with heavy initials. He held it for everyone. A murmur became a question. "Where did you get that?" Tomas demanded. Jacob breathed and said the names he'd kept in his head. "You sent the orders. You signed it." His sentence came in a ragged line. The crowd leaned in. The shift in the square had a physical pitch now. Curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Marek stepped forward from the shadow of the executioner's crate. His heavy frame cut between the magistrate and the front row. He held his axe by the haft, fingers white where he gripped. Marek's jaw worked. Tomas, speak plain." His voice was low and hoarse. He had no performative cruelty. He had the economy of a man who had learned that the work came down to motion. Tomas's mouth tightened. He dipped his chin and said, "The council ordered spectacle to teach obedience. The law is not for argument." He put emphasis on law, and the crowd's mood shifted like a tide. Some spat on the ground, others nodded. A woman near Jacob shouted, "He is a criminal. We punish criminals." Her voice split the square in two for a breath. A man called, "If Tomas says so, we do it." The crowd's chorus sounded like a rope tightening. Jacob felt fear wash in, a quick surge that clenched his stomach, but it blended with another movement inside him, resolve to make names stick. When fear arrived, he used it to sharpen speech. He croaked, "Look at the seal. You knew the orders would bring more than law. You wanted the ring of people to come back." He held the packet out with both hands until his arm trembled. Tomas's eyes flicked to Marek and back. "This is a lie," the magistrate said, "a bargaining trick of a condemned man. He seeks pity." He turned his face to the crowd and spread both hands in a civic gesture. The gesture was practiced. It begged the crowd to restore its trust in him. Voice lines crisscrossed, "Liar." Someone spat, "He'll trick us." Another shouted. Jacob measured breaths. He watched the magistrate count the people he trusted in the square. Jacob's emotion shifted again. From betrayal to a fragile hope that exposure might break the ritual. That hope was a small, dangerous thing. Outside the ring, a merchant dropped his tray of fish. The clatter refocused attention. A cluster shoved forward to see whether the condemned would move again. That external interruption sent a ripple of motion. At least 7 people surged nearer, mouths opened and closed. Marek lowered his axe but did not put it away. He wiped the haft on his apron with slow, mechanical motions. "Tomas, Marek, if you ordered a spectacle to teach obedience, say so plainly. The town needs to know." He did not challenge the magistrate's right to command. He demanded clarity in public. A man in the third row banged a stool and called,
"Clarity! Speak honest!"
The cry found purchase. The crowd's hunger for story had turned into hunger for a target. Tomas's fingers tightened on his staff. "We keep order. That is the only answer you need." The staff thumped the platform once. Jacob felt the square tilt. People who had come for curiosity now wanted a verdict. He realized his packet had changed the direction of the crowd's appetite. They no longer simply needed a spectacle. They wanted to know who had engineered it. That turn moved the story away from his body and toward political wound. The magistrate stepped closer, lowering his voice, so that only those near the front could hear. Marek, finish the business. Do it now, before this turns into a council matter." The order was clear. Marek's hand closed on the haft. Marek looked at Jacob with something like a flicker of doubt. "Jacob," he said, "a single name to find a man under the rope. Were you told to carry a packet?" The question hung like a scale. Jacob cuffed and answered, "No. I carried it because I kept a scrap of the world on me." He did not use the word memory in a sweeping sense. He named the packet as a document with a seal. "It proves the hand that turned this into a ritual." His voice failed at the end. Marek's breathing became a deliberate metronome. He raised the axe. The crowd made room. For a moment Marek's motion was all that mattered. He swung. The blade bit air and then oak again. It struck the platform and jumped. A groan rose from the crowd. The axe had not split this time, but it had not cleaved flesh cleanly either. It glanced. Pain spiked through Jacob and made him see stars of light. Shouts turned to a howl of anger. "He's cheating! Bring him down!" People pounded the rail with sticks. A cluster of men pressed forward, and the ring became loose. Tomas shouted orders and his voice cracked. The magistrate tried to keep the law's shape while the crowd pulled on it. Jacob felt something tear at his sleeve. He blinked and saw a hand reach over the rail. A stout man clambered onto the lower step with a crate to stand upon. He aimed a blow with a club. A girl in the front row began to weep. The mood that had carried curiosity shifted into raw anger. Inside that sudden violence, a new concrete event occurred. A hand grabbed the wax packet from Jacob's exposed chest. Fingers closed around the document and pulled. Jacob twisted his body and managed one desperate tug. He gasped and the packet slipped away, falling into the hands of a clerk in the crowd, a thin man with ink. Stained fingers whom Jacob had noticed earlier near the magistrate. The clerk read the seal as if he were reading a ledger. He swore softly and then shouted, "This is signed by the council's hand." He raised the packet like a charge. The declaration fractured the crowd again. Some muttered about trickery. Others whispered of Tomas's intent. Tomas's color drained a shade. He lunged forward and reached for the clerk's wrist. "Give it here," he said, backing his voice with the ceremonial weight of office. The clerk twisted, keeping the packet away. A tussle began on the platform's edge between two men arguing over a single scrap of paper. Merrick moved in with the blunt economy of his trade. He grabbed the clerk's arm and hauled him down from the rail, not to hurt but to separate. His breath came hard. "Enough," he said, "enough holds. Put the paper into the hands of men who will read it publicly." Merrick's voice sounded like an order every soldier recognizes. It demanded a procedure. The crowd responded by splitting. Some wanted the magistrate's head. Others wanted the clerk punished for exposing council secrets. A group of stout townsmen pushed forward with torches, brandishing them more as signals than as weapons. The situation escalated without a single dramatic twist beyond the sum of small, human choices. Magistrate Tomás made a decision in that second. He stepped back and with a slow, public motion he drew out a sealed parchment from beneath his robe. He broke it open and read it aloud in clipped phrases. The council authorized spectacle to reinforce obedience. "Public punishment shall serve as lesson." His voice repeated the words from the scrap and gave them official body. The crowd reacted like a body tested by a needle. Some recoiled from the explicit confession. Others applauded the honesty, mistaking it for firmness. Voices argued over whether a civic lesson justified prolonging suffering. The square fractured into shouting factions. Jacob listened and felt the final shift in him. Hope that exposure could change the course of his torment faltered into the raw fear that the magistrate would use the confession to reshape blame and keep his position intact. That fear made him small and quick. He tried to cough a laugh and failed. An argument between two men near the magistrate grew into a physical scuffle. Rapid lines of back and forth dialogue erupted. "He tricked us."
One man barked, "You knew!"
Another answered, "Tomás lied," cried a voice from the benches. The crowd supplied 3 to 5 short exchanges like a knife making small cuts that would bleed into the night. Merrick used the chaos to pull Jacob closer to the rail, trying to shield him with his bulk and with the performance of duty. "Jacob, I will not let them turn you into a prize. Hold on while I fetch proper men." Merrick's promise was a practical plan, not a speech. He moved with purpose and the crowd parted, making room for motion. A group of men did not move. They had seen enough spectacle and wanted to take matters into their own hands. One of them shouted, "We will decide here, without magistrates and without ceremony!" He lifted his torch. The voice carried the dangerous idea, a claim that popular will could substitute for law. The claim touched a nerve. A brawl began. Torches were shoved close to cloth, and a flare of flame licked a corner of a stall awning. The merchant who had dropped his fish now ran to stamp out the blaze. In the crowd's scramble, someone tripped and fell onto the platform and hit the edge of the oak. The sudden physical contact made a dull, sickening thud. A man at the platform's rim screamed that Jacob had been struck again by a stumbling body. Merrick lunged at the man who had pushed the torch. Hands collided. The magistrate seized the moment to step forward and demand order. He called for the constables. His voice had the ring of a man using his last authority. "Constables, remove those who would endanger the town." "Tomás." A constable did come forward, but not all recognized the badge. The presence of official cloth did not stop some men from looting a fallen trader's coin purse. The scene slid toward the kind of violence that feeds on rumor and opportunity. Jacob felt the heat of anger rise in the crowd and knew the platform could flip from stage to battlefield in a heartbeat. Near the platform, the clerk who had first held the wax packet now spoke to Merrick in short, urgent lines. "Tomás planned the draw," the clerk said. "He arranged for repeated appearances." "The seal is proof," Merrick responded with a single, tight sentence. "Then we will read this to every ring until they understand the cost of spectacle." The two men exchanged 3 quick lines about procedure and the clerk nodded. That decision became a pivot. Merrick climbed onto the lower step and addressed the nearest ring in a voice meant to cut through noise. He did not ask for a spectacle. He for witnesses. He ordered the clerk to read the document aloud. The clerk cleared his throat and read the council-sealed instruction, word for word, slow enough for everyone to hear each phrase. As the clerk read, the crowd's temperament transformed in small increments. Some who had shouted for blood now held their heads. Others turned their anger into debate. A woman whispered, "We have been taught to look away when our leaders order spectacle." Her line passed along the benches. The idea landed and spread. Still, not all changed. A group of men surged toward the magistrate and tried to pull him down from his steps. Tomas grabbed his staff and struck once to hold them off. The blow did not wound, but it announced that authority would not fall quietly. The attempt at direct retribution failed for a moment. It left the square in a state of bruise and bruisable resentment. Jakub felt a new, quieter pain, exhaustion. He had been kept alive in the gap between motions. He had been used as an object to fill a communal appetite. Now that the order's documents were exposed, he wondered whether his role would finally end or whether the town would invent new performances that replaced simple execution with public torment. He clenched his jaw and forced his hands to stillness. He would not scream to beg for mercy. He would watch faces to collect them into memory. Night crept in while the clerk continued to read, and small cages of conversation opened and closed across the square. Men argued about law, about morality, about who profited from prolonged spectacle. The magistrate's supporters gathered in a tight cluster and spoke in low tones. Merrick matched them with his own small group of practical men. The crowd began to split along lines the paper had made visible. Then a sudden, sharp sound snapped through the square. A cart overturned at the market alley, smashing crates and sending glass into a starburst. The noise pulled everyone to the rim. In that second distraction, a group of opportunists lunged toward the platform. The push turned into a scramble. Feet slid on blood-darkened wood. Jakub felt a searing strike across his shoulder as a man stumbled into him. Pain flared, and he blacked at the edges for a count of breaths. He came back with Marek's voice in his ear. "Hold on, Marek, hold to me." Marek's hands were large on his shoulder, steady and mechanical. Around them, men tore at boxes and at each other. The magistrate called for calm and the constables tried to herd people away. The square convulsed with choices made fast and selfish and small. When the dust settled a few moments later, Jakub noticed one concrete change. Several town leaders had been publicly named by the clerk as complicit. The naming did not end the town's appetite, but it redirected it. Some who had wanted blood now wanted testimony and accountability. The transformation was incomplete, but it opened a path where action could exist beyond spectacle. Magistrate Tomas stood with his robe soiled and his staff in hand. He addressed the square in a voice that was no longer purely commanding. It contained a note of calculation. "There will be an inquiry by men appointed from the council and the guilds," he announced. "We will take testimony. The condemned will be attended and the town will bear witness." His sentence aimed to fold the event back into civic procedure. A murmur of approval rose. Marek's face hardened and then relaxed a fraction. He helped ease Jakub down off the platform rail and spoke in short phrases to the constables about transport and a healer. The constables moved with the new assignment. The crowd thinned, some people following the constable's orders, others lingering to whisper and exchange coins. As the square emptied, a handful of townspeople remained near the platform's edge. A young woman placed a single candle near Jakub's foot. She did not speak. She sat on an overturned crate and watched him with a face set in a way Jakub recognized, not pity so much as attention. He mouthed, "Thank you," though he was not sure she heard. The candles flamed through hard gold across his pale skin and the blood, darkened grain of the platform. By the time the magistrate and Marek had arranged for Jakub to be carried to the healer's house, the square was mostly quiet. Men argued in clusters about proper procedure. Some still wanted immediate retribution for Tomas. Others muttered about the dangers of mob justice. The packet had changed the direction of grievance into debate. It did not erase harm, it only redirected it. At the healer's house, hands laid herbs across Jakub's wounds and wrapped fresh linen. Marek stood outside the door and kept his bulk between the house and any who might react violently. Tomas lingered at the gate, his face closed. The magistrate's mouth moved as if rehearsing a statement for the council. Jakub watched him and felt the betrayal settle again into a different shape. Tomas would defend himself, and the town would be left with questions over the cost of spectacle. Jakub whispered the names he had kept in his chest. He felt the emotion that had driven him, betrayal, ease into a long, watchful resignation. He had survived, and his survival had revealed a mechanism. He had become a witness rather than merely a victim. The change did not feel victorious, it felt necessary and brittle. When they carried him from the platform, the candle in the square guttered, and then a wind closed it. One constable stayed behind to place the discarded shoe and the small, torn linen gag on the platform as pieces of evidence. The square held those objects like proof. Behind the healer's shutters, voices argued and records were prepared. Outside, the night swelled with whispered deals and plans to claim advantage from the event. Jacob's last view before the healer's door closed was Magistrate Thomas lifting his staff and then setting it against the stone. Thomas did not look at him. Merrick put a hand over his shoulder in a brief, rough palm and said, "Names will be read. We will keep your list safe." Merrick's words were not a promise of comfort, but the sound of a man marking a duty. The square emptied, leaving a blood, darkened platform and a single candle as mute proof that cruelty outlived order. The packet would be read to elders, the magistrate would defend himself, Merrick would return to his tools, haunted by the haft that had split. The crowd would tell versions of the day that softened or sharpened blame. Jacob would be tended and later questioned. The immediate ordeal ended in practical steps. Testimony, inquiry, and the slow suture of law. There would be no neat justice that night. What remained was concrete. The names he had spoken, the seal on the paper, the magistrate's public words, and the people who had chosen which side to stand on. Those facts would shape the town's next moves. Jacob closed his eyes and focused on remembering faces. He had survived the botched blade and a town's appetite for spectacle. He kept counting names as the healer's hands moved, not because hope burned, but because memory could be a ledger against future betrayals. In the small dark behind closed shutters, men spoke in measured cadences and made lists. Outside, the square cooled. The candle guttered again, and the platform waited as a record of what had been allowed to happen. The chapter of the square's violence ended with action. A set of names slated for inquiry, Merrick's agreement to safeguard testimony, and the healer lifting the linen to expose a wound that would become a subject in a public question. There was no tidy moral, only the record of choices and a promise of procedure that would test whether the town would change what it found entertaining. The last sound before the shutters closed was the magistrate's slow counting of names to his clerk, and the last sight Jacob kept was Merrick's heavy hand on his shoulder, steady as a tool. Jacob breathed in the scent of bandage paste and wet straw and held the memory of those faces like a list. He would not be spectacle again unless the town demanded it. The concrete ledger of names and the packet in a clerk's pocket would decide next steps. He let his eyes fall shut on the lamp's weak wash and listened to the sound of men arranging the next day's testimony, each voice a small, distinct choice about what the town would remember and what it would bury. Outside, the empty benches cooled and the platform kept its stains. The candle went out. The square became a place to be cleaned or a place to be read about. In either case, the physical traces remained for those who would look. Jacob slept to the steady presence of Merrick's breath and the healer's soft movements, counting names so that betrayal would be a thing recorded, not a thing allowed to repeat.